Today we're going to examine an object that several people claim is extraterrestrial. An object from outer space, an object left here by aliens. Good to see you, my friend. We are actually going to go and touch this object. We're going to see it, look at it live in person. This is the object I'm talking about. So I was actually told about this object by a veteran UFO investigator in the previous episode. If you haven't seen that episode, I will leave a link to it here in the corner. So basically this UFO investigator told me about a guy who claimed that he was abducted by aliens and that these aliens have left an object with him here on Earth, and it's this magnesium rod. A weird looking magnesium rod, the one I just showed you. Then later I actually found out that this UFO investigator actually has a piece from this alien object in his apartment. I found out about this from a news report which has a bunch of extra information on this object. So what we're going to do today is we're going to dive deep into this case with this alien object, and we're going to look at, okay, could it possibly be extraterrestrial? So again, good to see you, my friend. I'm glad you're here. Let's go. Kicsit gondoltam rá, hogy biztos megengeded majd, hogy hozzájegyek, de hogy persze. Mondtad, hogy a fickó, aki ez volt, megbolondult.
De ő attól a tudattól lett zavaros, amit ennek az egész rúdnak tulajdonított. Tehát ebben semmi olyan nincs, hogy rázna, vagy sugározna, vagy bármi. Ez egy egyszerű fémdarab, 4,9-es tisztaságú magnézium darab. Tehát
na jó van, akkor...
Nyugodtan, tehát ezzel... Ez egy semmi.
És akkor vajon most...
Ez egy idegen... Ugye a magnézium ugye egy nagyon puha fém, de ez egy irtózatos, kemény valami. És ez benne szerintem az egyik nagyon különlegesség, hogy fogalmunk nincs, milyen technológiai eljárással tették ilyen keményé. Mert ugye ennek a Bakónak az elmondása alapján, amikor 94 tavaszán talán ezt a 36 centi rudat, aminek itt van a egyszerűsített változata, ami ez bemutatónak készült egyébként, hát már az idő megverte egy kicsit, de ez az eredeti rúd valamikor pontosan így nézett ki. Rajta ezzel a 9 aranypöttyel, ezzel a egyenlő szárú háromszöggel, ezzel a zölden világító csonka kúppal, a szem alatt, nevezzük ezt valami szemnek, egy valamilyen fólia jellegű valami volt, ami a röntgen átvilágításkor pedig itt középen egy ceruzahegynyi, a grafittól keményebb valami, mert nem tudta átvilágítani, valamilyen keményebb anyag volt. Amikor megtudtuk, hogy egyáltalán ez az anyag létezik, akkor már 3 darabba volt vágva. De én ezt a darabot láttam, és ezt a darabot láttam külön-külön, és a középső darabokból lettek ezek a darabok levágva. De elmondása szerint több fűrészlapot pusztított el, mire egy darabot levágott belőle. Annyira kemény. Annyira kemény. Egyébként látszik is, ha nagyítóval nézzük, hogy a vágások nagyon, adok nagyítót, ha kell, hogy nagyon-nagyon lassan ment a vágás, egy kézi fűrésszel darabolta szét. Hozzá kell tennem szerintem barbár módon.
Nagyon érdekes. És tehát ő már akkor a legelején elkezdett megbolondulni,
én azt gondolom,
mielőtt ez hozzátok eljut.
Igen.
So this is not a good sign. The fact that László Bakó, the guy who found this object, was already showing signs of mental illness by the time he showed the object to Árpád means that he is not a very reliable source, or at least it takes away from his reliability when we assess the believability of this story.
90-es évek végére, a 2000-es elejékre, tehát mi teljesen feladtuk az egészet, mert belekeveredett már szó szerint a KGB, a Mossad, mindenki, tehát már akkor látszott, hogy nem egy teljesen épelmélyű emberrel van dolgunk ezzel kapcsolatosan, és nem is adta ki többet a kezükből.
Now, one additional piece of information that I want to show you here is a piece from the news footage I told you about. They interviewed a guy called Sándor Pusztai, who was editor-in-chief and maybe still is at a UFO magazine in Hungary. And he talked about why this guy who found the object ended up destroying it.
Ennek a rúdnak volt egy úgynevezett szemrésze, és ő azt mondta, hogy ez a szem ez olyan őrült nagy hatással volt, szinte átváltoztatta az életét. Annyira tartott a rúdnak a sugárzásától, annyira tartott attól, hogy az egész rúd megkeserítette az életét, hogy gyakorlatilag megsemmisítette ezt a rudat.
Egyáltalán mi volt ez az egész? Hogy mire használhatták, miért hasonlít ez a naprendszer 9 bolygójára, miért mutat a harmadik szemre.
So there is actually a piece of footage in which László Bakó, the guy who found the object, tells us what he thinks the 9 golden dots and the golden triangle represent. Let's take a look at that.
Van rajta az a 9 aranygömb, azt vegyük a 9 bolygónak. És az a szem pont a harmadikra néz, mutat, hát mi a naptól vagyunk a harmadikak.
So the first problem with what he's saying is that there are 8 planets in our solar system and not 9. Now we could say that, okay, the first golden dot perhaps represents the sun and then the 8 planets. But in that case, his theory about the golden triangle pointing at Earth doesn't hold up, because then it should be pointing at not the 3rd overall dot, but the 4th one, because first dot sun, then 2 planets, and then the 4th dot should be representing Earth. Of course, I'm saying this because Earth is the 3rd planet from the sun. It goes sun, which is a star, Mercury, Venus, Earth. Now, there is actually a way for the 9 dots to represent only planets. And it is if Pluto is also counted or was counted as a planet by the aliens. But in that case, why are other dwarf planets not placed on there? And in fact, if the dots represent planets and one of them represents Pluto, then we actually have an issue, we have a problem here, because, you know, we might be suspicious that this is, after all, a human-made hoax, human-made object. Because if we go back to the time when this object was found by László Bakó, which was in the end of 20th century, then we find that Pluto was still considered a planet, for one, and that another dwarf planet very similar to Pluto, meaning almost the same size, was not discovered yet. And this planet is called Eris its diameter is only 36 kilometers larger than that of Pluto. And Eris was discovered in 2003. So it actually makes sense that if this was made by a human, and the human wanted to represent the 9 planets of our solar system, then he would have included Pluto, because Pluto was considered, as I said, a planet back then, and he would not have known about Eris. But if this rod was made by aliens and the 9 golden dots represent the planets of our solar system, then how did they not know about Eris, but they knew about Pluto? Even if they decided to neglect the smaller dwarf planets, but Pluto made the cut, then Eris should also have made the cut, because as I said, they're almost the same size. Like, if they have the capabilities, if they're so advanced to be able to travel to Earth and to just, abduct people out of the blue, take them on their spaceships and then place them back where they found them, then should they not be advanced enough to know that there is in fact another dwarf planet as large as Pluto that they should then have represented, with a 10th dot.
És itt a szem alatt pedig időnként fények villantak fel belülről. De hát felvillant a lila, a barna, nem csak a szivárványnak a színei.
Tehát van rá bármi esély, hogy ő ezt esetleg mégiscsak maga csinálta, ezt a magnéziumrudat? Tehát, hogy neki volt ehhez...
Én azt gondolom, hogy az embert ismerve, a jellemét, a gondolkodásmódját, akár az iskolázottságát.
Azt tudjuk, hogy mivel foglalkozott, vagy hogy ő mit?
Passz, nem. De egy egyszerű hétköznapi ember volt, szerintem minimális tanultsággal, de maga a rudnak a miensége, az, hogy semmi földi eszközre, akkor kort idézve semmi földi eszközre nem hasonlítható. Ugyanis elég durva, csúnya volt a felülete, mint amit smirgli papírral, durva smirglivel meghúznak. Tehát nem egy szép felületű, nem egy tükörsima felületű, és ugye minden egyes ilyen UFO katasztrófáról szóló dokumentumfilm, minden arról szól, hogy az anyag pillekönnyű. Ugye a Roswelli esetnél is azt hajtogatják a szemtanúk is, vagy a dokumentumok, hogy alufólia vékonyságú fémdarabokat találtak, ami mind emlékező fém volt, mert összegyűrték, kiegyenesedett, elvágták, a vágás visszament.
Ja igen, hogy ő emlékezett arra, hogy mi történt elvileg az eltérítés
amikor
alatt.
Ezt megkapta? Igen. Azt mondta, hogy egy nyári napon történt 74-ben, a debreceni gördülő csapágy művek, tehát ez a temetővel szemben lévő oldal Debrecenben, hogy megyünk Nyíregyháza fele, ott volt valami baráti segítségre, ilyen kerti munkára. És mivel nyár volt, nagyon meleg volt, kint a teraszon aludt, és arra emlékezett, hogy ahogy elaludt, nem sokkal később valami nagyon világos, ferde tetejű, ferde plafonú szobában ébredt, ül valami asztalnál, valami zebracsíkos monitorok előtt, ahol egy kis méretű ember, egy ilyen 120-130 cm-ös valaki, mögüle ezzel a rúddal magyarázott a képernyőkön, a monitoron mutogatott neki valamit. Olyasmire emlékszik, hogy már elhagytuk a Földet, különböző csillagrendszereket mutatott a monitoron, hogy honnan jöttek, meg valami. Azt mondja, utána értelmetlen kifejezésekre emlékszik, amiről fogalma nem volt. Majd, amikor újra magához tért, összegörnyedve fekszik, ugyanott egyébként, ahonnan idézőjelben talán elvitték, fáj a feje, szédül, hányingere van, rosszul érzi magát, és egy papírdoboz tetején megpillantja ezt a valamit. De mivel abban az időben a társadalom vagy a politikai rendszernek a hozzáállása miatt nagyon nem volt ildomos erről beszélni, félt is, ezt fogta, beletette egy szolos csőbe, két végét ledugzózt, talán vagy 18 évre elásta a földbe az egészet. Addig félt elővenni. Azt mondja időnként, talán kétszer vette előtt a 18 év alatt, megnézegette, visszatette, megint visszaásta, és amikor megalakultak az első UFO klubok, illetve a 80-as évek végén már megjelentek olyan témájú könyvek, hogy lehetett erről beszélni, na akkor lépett ő elő ezzel a valamivel.
So first of all, the fact that he fell asleep and was abducted after he fell asleep is again something that raises suspicion. I mean, that could have just, been a dream. And as for the object, I mean, we have to remember that he was on someone else's property, helping out. Could it be perhaps that he actually picked up something that belonged to the people he was helping out? And could it be that those people, if we could ask them today, would actually know exactly what the object is? But of course, it's strange that, all the other people who were shown this object, and of course, this object was also presented at a big UFO Congress in Debrecen in the 1990s. And so it's strange that nobody realized what this is, if this is indeed just a mundane object. And another thing we should be a little suspicious about investigating this case is that he waited until UFO abduction stories were already out there before he came out with his own. On the one hand, we might think, okay, he was afraid of being labeled a crazy person and that's why he didn't come out before. But then when he saw all these other abduction stories, he then, became brave enough to come out with what happened to him, seeing that other people also went through similar things. But on the other hand, we could also suspect that perhaps he was inspired by all those stories, all those abduction stories, and that's when he came up with his own, and that's when he came forward claiming he went through what he went through. And perhaps unwillingly, perhaps not because he wanted to fool people or because he wanted attention, but because he was mentally ill. But then again, we can also say if he was really abducted by aliens, in the 1970s, would you not go crazy? We can of course also think about it from that perspective. So perhaps, we could even attribute the mental illness to the abduction, if we want to believe him.
Aki írt anyagvizsgálathoz, az azt mondta erről, hogy ilyen sűrűségben ír horribilis összeg előállítani. Valószínű ma már meg tudjuk csinálni. De ha igaz a történet, akkor 74-ben közünk nem volt egy ilyen tisztaságú magnéziumot előállítani.
Alright, now let's look a little closer into this. In the news report I mentioned, there is a man who does say the same thing as Árpád does, that it would cost a horrific amount to produce such a pure magnesium rod.
Semmiféle ismert mondani valója, üzenettartalma nincs. Horribilis az előállítási költsége.
And according to the report, this guy was a laboratory leader at the University of Debrecen. So this guy seems like a reliable source, like somebody who would actually know something about this topic. Although, of course, we have to admit, I don't know his exact credentials. Now, the editor-in-chief of the UFO magazine also adds a little piece of information here. Let's look at that.
Nagyipari eszközökkel, nagyipari termeléssel ekkora magnézium tartalmú anyagot nem szokás és nem is szükséges.
And actually the journalist doing the voiceover on the news report, he comes with an additional source here.
A Budapesti Műszaki Egyetem gépjármű szerkezeteket tervező szakember ugyan nem nyilatkozott, de azt megerősítette, ilyen tisztaságú magnéziumra tudomása szerint az ő szakterületén legalábbis nincs is szükség.
This source seems like a reliable one as well, and he doesn't claim anything huge, but what he does claim does support the claim that this rod is a very unusual object. And finally, we have another snippet of information that is relevant here at the very end of this news report. The reporter says, and I'm going to read this: allegedly, such pure magnesium is manufactured in the realms of chemistry and pyrotechnics, but only in the form of powder, never as an object. So of course I translated this from Hungarian.
Vagy totálisan véletlen hagyták itt, vagy abból az aspektusból, hogy nesze ember, itt van valami, mire tudod használni. Mennyire vagy intelligens, mennyire vagy civilizált, mennyire tudjuk kibontani az elmédet vele.
Még csak annyit akarok kérdezni, hogy akkor ezt ő odaadta a te volt mentorod, vagy munkatársad?
Hát
volt?
aki alapította ki a 80-as évek végén, 89-ben a Kis Lászlónak, a UFON alapítójának 2 ilyen darabot kapott, és az, mivel én vettem át a klub vezetését, ő adott nekem egy ilyen darabot, tehát valószínű a néhai elhunytnál is, vagy az örökségében valahol még lenni kell esetleg egy ilyen darabnak.
So we as investigators have to remember here that we've been told that this is a 99.99% magnesium rod with 1% of polonium in it, but we haven't been shown any actual evidence, any actual papers of such findings, such conclusions. So I asked Árpád if he would lend this small remaining piece to me if I could find anybody who would be willing to examine it and perhaps again, show us what it consists of. And he said yes. So now we just have to find somebody who could actually get the examination done properly. All right, I gotta stop it right there because something occurred to me. An idea that has not occurred to me the whole way through working on and cutting that footage that you've seen so far. To put into Google 2 simple words: magnesium rods. To look into whether magnesium rods are actually made here on Earth, whether such objects are manufactured here, are used for something by humans. Very early on, in the very first interview, I accepted Árpád's claim that this is an object that makes no sense, that this is an object that they had no idea what it could be used for. So the only research I did was researching the magnesium rod of Debrecen, but not magnesium rods in general. So I did end up putting the words magnesium rods into Google. And I did find such objects, and they are, yes, made here on Earth by humans. And in fact, you can buy them easily, you can buy them online. And funny enough, one of the selling points on several of these rods that I found was that they are 99.99% pure magnesium. Okay, so according to one of the websites that sells such magnesium rods, they have several uses. For example, they are used as sacrificial anodes. They are used for making magnesium torches that burn underwater, and they are used as lighters as well, since magnesium is very easy to ignite. So there are in fact good reasons for making magnesium rods. And this is contrary to many of the things that were said during this video so far by Árpád and by the other people we saw in the news report. Árpád did say that it was probably possible to make such pure magnesium nowadays, but he never mentioned that such objects, magnesium rods, are actually widely used in our world and that they can easily be bought. The news report did not mention any of this either. So the question is, did they do a bad job as journalists, or did they do it on purpose? Did they know about all of this but decided not to say it so that they can air a more sensational story? Because let's remember that the news report that we looked at was actually made in 2015, so that's not that long ago. So now that we know that such objects exist, Question is, how long have these been made? To try to answer that, let's look at one of the uses of magnesium rods, which is sacrificial anodes. So these rods, these anodes, are part of cathodic protection systems. And these systems are used to protect submerged or buried metal structures. Okay, so what does that mean? So let's take an example. Let's say that a magnesium rod is placed inside of a water heater and connected to it. And of course, a water heater is a metal structure. The reason why the magnesium rod is placed in there is because it has a more active voltage than the metal structure around it. And what this means is that its voltage is actually more negative. And then this difference in electric potential between the magnesium rod and the metal structure around it means that the magnesium rod is going to corrode instead of the metal structure, which in this case is the water heater. That's why it's called a sacrificial anode, because it sacrifices itself to protect the metal structure around it from corrosion. For this purpose, magnesium rods are used in, for example, onshore pipelines, the hulls of ships and boats, water storage tanks, and, as I said, water heaters. Now, why did I highlight sacrificial anodes? Because they were first used in 1824 on a British Royal Navy ship called the HMS Semarang. Now, those were not magnesium anodes, but they were sacrificial anodes. Then later, from 1928, they actually started using cathodic protection systems with sacrificial anodes in steel gas pipelines in the United States. I'm highlighting these dates because, of course, they happened much earlier than the 1970s, which is, of course, when Bakó found his alien rod. But then the question is, when were specifically magnesium anodes invented? When did they start using magnesium anodes? Was it before Bakó found his alien rod? I couldn't find an answer to that, but I called several companies that make or sell anodes, and two guys from two of the companies that I called told me that they would guess that magnesium anodes showed up in the 20th century. But what I do know is that magnesium itself was first isolated in England in 1808 by a man named Sir Humphrey Davy. He was a British chemist and inventor, and he also happens to be the man who first described cathodic protection, the system that uses sacrificial anodes, in papers presented to the Royal Society in London in 1824. So the same man who first isolated magnesium is the man who first described cathodic protection systems, the system that uses sacrificial anodes. So based on this, it's not really far-fetched to think that it is likely that he was the one who came up with using magnesium, which he isolated, in sacrificial anodes. Of course, I don't know if that is true, but I would say it seems pretty likely. And so if you look at the dates again, he isolated magnesium in 1808, and he first described cathodic protection systems in 1824. These dates are long before, more than a century before Bakó found his magnesium rod. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about purity. As I said, one of the companies that I called was Performance Metals, which makes aluminium rods. I talked to a man named Martin Wigg who told me that anodes usually consist of several metals, but that each metal within anodes has to be very pure. Otherwise, performance might be impacted. So he told me that, for example, if there are trace elements in aluminium anodes, such as iron, then that will worsen their performance. An interesting extra little piece of information I found is that photographers were actually using magnesium powder in flashlights as early as the 19th century. I found an issue of Scientific American published in 1895 in which magnesium torches are described as useful tools for photographers. And these torches used pure magnesium powder, according to the paper. So if my research isn't off on this, then pure meant, even back then, 100% pure magnesium. And this, of course, means that humans were actually able to make 100% pure magnesium powder already back in 1895. Almost a century before Bakó and his purported alien abduction and the rod. But the question still remains, what about the golden parts of the alien rod, the golden triangle and the golden dots? And I actually have a theory on this. I found a video in which you can see a corroded magnesium rod. And if we take a look at this video, we can see that the corroded part looks kind of goldenish. It does look different than the alien rod of Debrecen, but I mean, it is kind of goldenish. So I thought, what if the golden parts of the magnesium rod found by Bakó are simply corroded parts left on the rod? What if somebody, either Bakó or someone else, scraped all the other parts off, scraped the corrosion off the rest of the rod, but left the triangle and left the 9 golden dots? And actually, let's think back to what Árpád said. He said that the surface of this magnesium rod was very rough. It was kind of like something scraped with sandpaper, he said. So what if that's exactly what happened? What if somebody scraped the corrosion off with sandpaper and left that little design with the golden triangle and the 9 golden dots? So I actually asked Martin Wigg from Performance Metals the following question. If we take a magnesium rod that has partly corroded and scrape off the corroded surface with something like sandpaper, would we still find metallic looking magnesium underneath? His answer was, yes, I guess you would. So where does all of this leave us? There are actually a couple of questions left. If the golden dots and the triangle are not corroded parts, how did they get there? How did a dark piece of film get under the triangle? And finally, what is that piece in the rod that was not identified, but that, according to Árpád, is stronger than graphite? So in light of all of these revelations, and in light of the fact that Bakó was mentally ill, I do not think that the rod found in Debrecen was actually an alien object. And in fact, I don't even think it makes sense to take that small piece of the rod, which we looked at in Debrecen, and examine it any further. I mean, we do know now that 99.99% pure magnesium rods do exist, and humans can make them. So that was a little bit disappointing in the end, but at least we got somewhat to the bottom of it. And it's a good lesson in terms of investigating UFOs, because it shows us how, you know, a claim that I just accepted early on kept me from doing the proper research needed. You know, I kind of sort of assumed somewhere that they must have done the research. I mean, they must have looked into whether magnesium rods are a thing at all, but they didn't. So we should, as investigators, never assume that people already did the research. You always need to do the research yourself. Tehát ez volt akkor a legerősebb, mondjuk úgy bizonyíték,
Igen.
amit a te UFO kutatás, hosszú UFO kutató történeted alatt találtál.
Volt egy másik nagyon érdekes eset, azt hiszem 97 vagy 98-ban történt.
Alright, my friends, so that was it for this episode. Let me know what you think about my conclusion. Leave a comment, let me know, I'm interested in what you think. So until the next time, you can visit thenonfictionway.com, which is a website I'm still working on, still developing. You can also visit my Instagram, which is where I post my photography. So that's also a kind of non-fiction. I take pictures of stuff that happens in my life, people who are part of my life. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, but would like to join me on this journey of investigating UFOs, as well as other topics later down the line, then you can hit the subscribe button and join the non-fiction way of life. And I will see you, my friend, in the next episode as we continue our journey through this very, very, very interesting field of ufology. I'll see you.